Ben has, in the last 10 to 15 years, been probably the most consistently successful writer of non-fiction in Great Britain. And has won both critical, literary, academic, and popular awards, as well as selling very nearly 3 million copies. Not quite as many as Frankopan, but nearly as many as Peter.
There's no envy here.
So I'd like to say that I'm not at all bitter, twisted, or confused by this, and that I'm going to conduct myself with great equanimity as we discuss this blazing career of success and brilliance. But in particular, I think the moment that Ben's career lurched off into the stratosphere was the moment that you started writing spy books. And why do you think that there is this enduring and eternal fascination with the secret world? Or is it simply that it is the secret world?
Well, I mean, I'll go back even one stage before that. I mean, the reason I got involved in all of this was that I was recruited by the Foreign Intelligence Service, by MI6, the day I left Cambridge. I mean, Cambridge is famously stuffed with spies. And my recruiting was straight out of sort of Monty Python, really. I mean, my tutor on the very last day of term said, well, I think you ought to know, Ben, there are parts of the Foreign Office that are different from the Foreign Office, in the sense they're not actually really the Foreign Office. And he went on, like, he never actually said what it was I was supposed to be going to do, but I then went and met this Major Halliday in a basement room under Whitehall. And
is that his real name?
No, because I subsequently discovered there are at least 5 Major Hallidays. Major Halliday was the cover name for whoever the recruiter was. And we had this bizarre conversation where, again, he never quite said what it was I was supposed to be doing. And at the end of that, it became pretty clear that I wasn't really the sort of material they wanted. But partly because, as I've just demonstrated, I can't keep a secret. But actually, I think that I've always been fascinated by that world. I think the secret, the world of espionage allows non-fiction writers to write about the subjects that novelists normally commandeer: loyalty, love, betrayal, adventure, romance. But because of the funny way that the spy world works, it can all be true. And is all true, because spies are also extremely indiscreet. They tend to create their own myths around themselves. They tend to be quite sort of open, actually, when they leave the service. And so you can get that kind of depth of detail that you need if you're trying, as I am trying usually, to write a non-fiction narrative that reads like a novel, but is nonetheless every word of it true. And so almost uniquely, I think the world of espionage enables you to do that. I mean, there are other ways you can do it. War is another one. But so I think there's that, and I think it's also the double life is a very attractive. It's a very attractive notion. The idea that we may look like one thing on the outside, but actually on the inside we're someone completely different. And I think actually that is a particularly British obsession. I think the idea, someone once described it... Doesn't it?
I mean, you say it's attractive. Surely it does everyone's head in eventually, isn't it?
Yes, I think it probably does drive you mad. I mean, I've never been certain whether spying drives you mad or it simply attracts people who are already slightly mad. But yes, I mean,
reading your Philby book, for example, which we'll come to later, but I mean, by the end, he's drinking incredibly heavily and taking unbelievable risks every day.
Well,
and betraying people he knows well.
But alcohol and spying is a fascinating subject because, of course, alcoholics, people who become dependent on alcohol, are living in a parallel world already. The first drink, they've gone into another room. They're looking at themselves from the outside. Often it's thought that alcohol is a way of getting people to be indiscreet. The reverse is true in the spy world. Lots of them relied on alcohol as a way of kind of removing themselves from their real lives. But yes, I mean, it is a sort of it's a strange thing to want to do, but yet I think it is something we are all slightly attracted to. We like the idea that we're on the 97 bus and I know a little bit more than the man standing next to me. And I think that's someone once described, William Boyd actually described it once as the ruthless exercise of private power. And I think that is absolutely right. I think that's one of the things that really pulls us towards the spy world.
At this point, we actually should mention Le Carre, who actually read your work and I think you worked with a little bit.
I did. I mean, David Cornwell, John Le Carre, was a good friend, actually. I mean, became a really quite close friend. He very unsolicited. He wrote a blurb for one of my books, and I didn't ask.
The Philby book?
No, earlier than that, Agent Zigzag, the very first one, and we became close friends. And he was extraordinary. I mean, I still think of that world. He's the one whose grip on the sort of psychological depth of that, and particularly a kind of British take on the whole thing. I mean, I made this joke yesterday, but it is nonetheless true. I think British people have a particular talent for deception. We like the idea of looking one way on the outside and being something completely different.
What was the Persian quote you gave yesterday?
Which one was that? Oh,
the Persians never say what they mean, and the British
never mean what they say. Exactly. But it's, I find it a fascinating world to delve around in, and I think it does enable one to explore all sorts of questions of sort of loyalty and personality and character, and it does attract a particularly kind of strange. We were talking about corkscrew minds yesterday. I mean, you have to want to do this stuff. You have to have a particular sort of mind. And although this sounds a strange thing to say for someone who's written, 13 books about spying, but actually spying on the whole doesn't make a great deal of difference. It doesn't really usually change the world. Spying at its best is a way of oiling the wheels of traditional diplomacy, of making us all a bit safer, of increasing... But very occasionally, espionage really changes the course of the world. And when it does, it's very dramatic. So Bletchley Park, Operation Mincemeat, Agent Sonya, even old Agent Zigzag, they all... Philby, absolutely. So the secret world does inform the non-secret world. And I'm fascinated by the interplay between, as you know, fiction and non-fiction, truth and reality, the secret world and the public world that it manipulates, unseen by most of us most of the time.
I, like you, like writing non-fiction that has the elements of a novel, and getting into moments when you have an archive that allows you to get in people's heads so closely and quote their words so tightly that it can give the appearance of fiction. But I've never written fiction because I think, in a sense, this is more fun because it's true. Do you feel like that, or
absolutely?
Because you've never written a novel.
I've never written a novel. I would never dare write a novel. I wouldn't know where to stop. I mean, how could you? Where would the end be? Where would the beginning be? I mean, you and I have archives. We have facts. We have letters. We have diaries. We have poems. We have postcards. We have all the stuff of real life. And I've always felt that if you've got all of that, why would you make it up? Why? And I'm pretty rigorous about that. I mean, as I know you are, Willie, I think it's very important, and it's almost an obligation to one's readers to be absolutely honest with them, and to say, if you don't have the evidence, and you will know as I do, sometimes you're halfway through researching a book and there's a huge gap. You just don't know what happened. And I think it's...
And then sometimes you do stumble on the trunk that has the stuff
absolutely
in that gap, and it's the most sort of thrilling moment.
Wonderful feeling. But I also think that... And I don't know if
it's always different from how you think it might have been, too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's part of the adventure. Part of the journey is finding that actually the story you thought you were researching turns out to be something else. But I do think when you don't have the information, I always try to be quite rigorous about this and say to the reader, we don't know what happened. I can't solve this for you. You know, there is a gap here. There's a 5-year break. There's a hole in the story. And actually, I think that's very important to say, because I think your readers then even unconsciously think, right, so the rest of this, when he says the sky was blue and the sunflowers were blooming, that's because he knows they were. And I hope I've been completely consistent on that.
Patrick French, I remember saying when he was writing, I think his Young Husband book, had a quote from, who's the guy that wrote Footsteps? Richard Holmes.
Yes.
A Richard Holmes story, quote, which says exactly that. Unless you know it was shining at 9 o'clock in the morning of the 15th of October, you cannot say that it was.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the moment you succumb to that temptation, you're writing a novel. And that's a completely different story. But it's, you know, and I rather love it when people say, how do you know that? How do you know that he smelled of oranges that morning? And the lovely thing is, you have the
got
evidence.
the footnote.
You've got the footnote that says how you know.
Just as well you've got the footnote, because often you can't remember 2 years later where on earth any of this stuff came from. So unless you write the
my
footnote,
main mistake on these things is I never write them as I'm going along, so I then have to reread all the books I've read again, start again.
Funnily enough, I've just been turning a bit of a proposal into an introduction. And in a proposal, you don't need footnotes. But of course, in an introduction, you do. Trying to find the quotes from 3 years ago, I cannot find half of them. I have to drop it until they turn up. Anyway, let's get going. We've got quite a lot of books. And one of the other things that really irritates me about Ben is that he manages to write these spectacular books at a rate of one every 2, maximum 3 years. And anyway, so let's start with the Wartime Trilogy. Yesterday we had Operation Mincemeat, so we maybe glance over that. But Agent Zigzag and then Double Cross.
Well, Agent Zigzag was the one that started me off on this strange story. I'd never wanted to write or expected to write about spies before that. And his story is so extraordinary. Agent Zigzag was the code name for a wartime criminal and spy whose name was Eddie Chapman. And Eddie Chapman was a professional con man and safe breaker and seducer and terrific fellow, marvellous man. Absolute raging shit. I mean, he was a horrible man in lots of ways, but completely intoxicating for lots of people. And he committed a lot of crimes before the war, none of violence, mostly he was the first to import gelignite to Britain. So he ran something called the Jelly Gang, which went around just breaking safes, really. And he happened to be in prison in Jersey when the Germans invaded. And he was facing a very long set of prison sentences back in Britain, and he made a deal with the Germans that if they trained him up and dropped him back into Britain, he would spy for them in Britain during the war, which is what they did. They trained him up in a special spy school in Nantes and parachuted him into Cambridge in 1942. He landed near Ely, hit the ground, broke his nose, and immediately defected to MI5, and so volunteered to spy for MI5 against the Germans. Which he did. I mean, the Brits got him back into occupied Europe, where he was then providing information from German high command back to Britain. The problem with Chapman was that he was such a crook. No one was ever sure exactly whose side he was on, hence Agent Zigzag, because they were just never quite trusted him. But he was a wonderful character, and I don't want to give the book away in case any of you read it, but it doesn't stop there. I mean, where he zigs, he then zags. And wonderfully, the most marvellous thing about Eddie Chapman was that he ended up as the crime correspondent for the Daily Telegraph.
I love it.
Where most of his column was devoted to warning readers against people like him. He had a brilliant byline photo of him sitting next to his roller with a kind of big fur coat on, and you just know he's a total crook.
And was any of this stuff known in his lifetime, or did he keep it completely quiet?
Well, you see, again, interestingly, he wrote a sort of memoir after the war called Triple Cross, which was made into a very bad film.
Yes, it's a famous book, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, the film is quite well known. It's got Yul Brynner and Christopher Plummer in it. The book is a brilliant tissue of lies. I mean, some of it's true, some of it's half true. Most of it is completely invented by Chapman because he didn't believe that the files would ever be released. And that's the wonderful thing about delving around in this world. As I was saying yesterday, the files are written by... The sort of intelligence files are not meant to be read by anybody outside that circle. So they're completely honest. So when you've got someone like Chapman, you get these very, very frank assessments of him by the people around him. And the reason I could write that book was because, again, the files were released. Is
that a new thing? When did
pretty new
Freedom of Information Act? Or?
No. It was a decision by the Blair government in 1997 to start reversing the official secrecy rules that had pertained up until that point. And they began to release MI5 files. Now, MI5 is the internal security organization of Great Britain. MI6 is the external spy agency. MI6 never releases its files, but MI5 now does, and it does so on a systematic basis. So after 50 years, they can release anything that they want to. Of course, they don't release everything because anything that's linked to national security or privacy or anything that they're not terribly proud of doesn't tend to get released so easily. But the Zigzag
Can
files,
you apply for it?
You can.
Yeah.
You can. You can try and persuade them. And actually, they've worked out cleverly, MI5, that telling their own story is a brilliant recruiting sergeant. It's a great way of getting people to join. And the Zigzag files are wonderful because they contain his own writings, the poems he was writing in prison. He was a highly intelligent chapman, multilingual. I mean, an extraordinary man in lots of ways. His widow is still alive, believe it or not. She's an unreconstructed gangster's mole of 97. And she's in an old people's home in Amersham, and every so often she rings me up to try and get money out of me. It's marvellous. It's
Blackmail you, or?
Yeah. It's like being shaken down by a sort of nonagenarian. It's absolutely extraordinary. With threats, too. It's marvellous.
So, Mincemeat we had yesterday, but Double Cross is the sequel to Mincemeat. So the guy gets dropped off the coast of Spain, they invade Sicily, and Hitler doesn't believe they're doing it. But then you have, almost immediately after that, everyone preparing for D-Day. What's going on? Like, already, do the Germans know that they've been fooled with Mincemeat, or...?
No, they hadn't actually ever quite worked out that they'd been bamboozled with Mincemeat. They just thought that the Allies had somehow changed their minds at the last moment. Yeah, I mean, so then the D-Day deception, which is weirdly the opposite of Mincemeat, because Mincemeat was trying to persuade the Germans that the obvious target wasn't the target. D-Day was trying to persuade them that the obvious target was the target. So the obvious target for D-Day was Calais. It's the closest to Britain. It's the easiest place to land at. It's an important deep water port. It's the obvious place to launch the second front from. So the whole of the D-Day deception was to try to persuade them that, yeah, that's right, that's where they were going. They built an entire fake army on the Kent coast, complete with rubber tanks that could be seen from the air. The problem with those was that in high winds they would sort of take off. But the principal way they did it was with a group of double agents. Now, these were people who had been sent into Britain to spy for the Germans, but had been turned in most cases. It's one of the more extraordinary espionage achievements of all time, really, was that Britain, largely thanks to the Bletchley Park intercepts, the interceptions of the secret intelligence that the Germans were sending, were able to intercept every single spy, as we know, except one that came into Britain.
We have to have the name.
Well, the one they didn't get went by the unimprovable name of Engelbertus Fucken. And his body was found in a disused bunker in Cambridge, and nobody knows how Engelbertus Fucken got into the country. But every other one was picked up, and they were either executed, or they were turned, or they were mimicked. They would use their radios to send back messages to the Germans that appeared to be coming from genuine agents. But they went one stage further than that. I mean, this story is full of very picaresque, bizarre characters. My own favourite was one who was codenamed Bronx. Her real name was Ira de la Fuente Chaudoir, and she was a bisexual Peruvian playgirl who had been sort of recruited by the Gestapo, in fact, and then sent into Britain, and very willingly spied for Britain against the Germans. But my favourite one is one called Agent Garbo, who was he was a Spanish chicken farmer who had convinced himself in Spain that he really wanted to spy against the Germans. He hated the Germans, so he kept volunteering to spy for the Abwehr in Spain. And of course, if you volunteer to spy, they don't, on the whole, tend to want you. So he decided to go freelance, and he moved to Portugal and began sending information to the Germans as if he was in Britain, a place he had never been to. So he learnt it all from the local library, and it's brilliant stuff because it's full of hilarious mistakes. He says at one point, he said, "I'm in Glasgow." He wasn't, he was in Lisbon. "I'm in Glasgow at the moment where they will do anything for a pint of wine." Well, I mean, Glaswegians will probably do anything for a pint of wine. It's not their favourite tipple. Anyway, so the Brits picked up these messages and realised, or thought they realised, that there must be some spy operating in Britain, a very eccentric one. So they've worked out who it was. They brought him to Britain. They put him in a house in Hendon, and he began to invent a whole series of sub-agents. He ended up with about 25 in all. all of whom were completely invented. None of these people existed, but they all had to have their own backstories, their own radios, their own ways of communicating with the Abwehr, with the Germans, and that was the basis on which the deception was plotted. This extraordinary group of non-existent people that were made.
All of whom were pretending to spy for the Germans, but weren't.
Yes, they were. They didn't. They weren't real people. But that's right. So this web of disinformation could then be fed back to the Germans, and it worked extraordinarily well. And again, the Germans never quite realised what was happening because they just assumed that at the last moment the Allies must have changed. But this one you can track very clearly because they are moving panzer divisions from the south of France to Calais. They're not going to Normandy where the attack is actually taking place. They're actually moving whole panzer divisions up to repel an invasion at Calais that never happened. And 4 days after the invasion, the Germans were so pleased with Agent Garbo for all the stuff he'd sent over, they awarded him the Iron Cross.
And they stayed in Calais. They didn't come down to.
Well, eventually they realised that an invasion. I mean, it didn't take them that long, but in that situation, minutes were absolutely vital. Every minute that they could delay the movement to defend Normandy made that invasion.
So they got this. They got all the armies on shore into France.
Yes,
and then they had this terrible moment when the panzer divisions turn up, and they're fighting through the hedgerows.
That's right. Yeah. But by that point, they've established the beachhead. What they were terrified of was that if again, it's a little like what we were talking about yesterday. This was a strategic deception, not a tactical deception. So that if
what's the distinction?
Well, the overall strategy was what they were attempting to change, not the sort of actions on the ground specifically. It's a much bigger thing. So if the Germans had realised that they were being strategically misled towards Calais, they would realise that it wasn't going to be Calais, it was going to be Normandy. And then the consequences of that would have been horrendous. And it was a close-run thing anyway. It's not as if the Atlantic War wasn't well defended anyway. So these are minor gradations, but every hour the panzer divisions were going in the wrong direction was helping that.
Oh, exciting. So from there, you move into the post-war period, into the Cold War, and you said yesterday that at the same time that the British are very successfully hoodwinking the Nazis, they themselves are being completely penetrated by Russia and by lots of left-wing Brits hating themselves, often public school boys brought up with in the class system and longing for a more egalitarian world, see Marxism, see communism as a solution, and so you have a spy service which is brilliantly running rings around the Germans, but is itself having all its information sent off to Moscow.
That's right. I mean, the British intelligence service was more comprehensively penetrated by Soviet intelligence than any other spy service in history. I mean, it was an absolute calamity, and for the Brits. In order to get it in context, though, I think one has to remember that to be a young Englishman, almost always men, in the early 1930s of a left-wing inclination, it was a perfectly respectable position with the Spanish Civil War raging to think the only way of stopping fascism is communism. That's the future. That's how we're going to stop this. And we look at it now through a Cold War prism that seems impossible to us today. But I think people like you and I, Willie, we would have been very, very interested in that side of the project. We'd probably have fallen away quite quickly, I suspect,
because an awful lot of people like H.G. Wells, for example, were very publicly saying how wonderful Stalin was in Britain, and very public figures saying very openly how wonderful Stalin was. And then as the news begins to leak in of Ukraine famines and so on, it gets more complicated.
It gets much more complicated. The Malcolm Muggeridges, the fellow travellers, but most of them by 1956, the scales have fallen from their eyes after Hungary, and often before then. What interests me in a way are those that stuck with it, the Philbys.
Which brings us to Philby. So who is Philby?
So
this is an audience that probably don't know.
Well,
Philby.
Kim Philby was a highly intelligent left-winger at Cambridge, had been to Westminster. He came from a very upper-class family. He wore the right tie, he had the right accent. But he'd been recruited by, very early on, in 1933, he was recruited by a brilliant NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, recruiter called Arnold Deutsch. Now, Deutsch was a very few people know about him. He was a highly intelligent Czech. He was a doctor by training. Very, very charming. He and his brother Oscar Deutsch arrived as refugees from Czechoslovakia. Oscar Deutsch went on to found Odeon Cinemas. Odeon stands for Oscar Deutsch Educates Our Nation.
No.
Yeah, so one brother became an extremely successful capitalist. The other, Arnold, was recruiting spies. And he was absolutely brilliant. There wasn't just a Cambridge spy ring, there was an Oxford spy ring as well. They weren't as good, obviously, but we went to Cambridge. But he was highly successful, and Kim Philby was among his first recruits. And it was a brilliant strategy because they were planting seed capital. They knew that these characters were not going to achieve positions of authority and importance for a considerable period. But they just planted them and left them to grow. And Philby was the most successful. I mean, he ended up, at their behest, joining MI6, and he shot up through the ranks of MI6. So he was privy to everything, really, that was happening inside British intelligence. And then he became head of the Soviet section. So he wasn't just guarding the hen coop. He was the fox building the hen coop. So he could tell the Soviets what the West was doing before it did it. And the butcher's bill on
even
that.
before it knew it was going to do it, if he was running
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah, he was making the decisions to do it. I mean, he was sending people across the Iron Curtain to carry out missions that he'd already sabotaged. And as I say, the butcher's bill on that was huge. I mean, we don't know exactly how many people were killed, certainly hundreds, probably thousands. I mean, Albania, for example, that was one of his main targets. The CIA and the British were pouring parachute agents into Albania. And when they landed, they were being intercepted by name. The waiting security forces of Albania knew exactly who was coming and where they were coming. They rounded them up and their families, and they executed the lot. And there were thousands of them.
And what's the psychology there when Philby knows this happening? I mean, obviously he gets a sense of a kick from the power, maybe, but it can't be easy for anyone to know that you've been directly led to the deaths of hundreds of people you know in many cases, presumably, and often people you've directly sent off into the plane to get killed.
Well, his justification was that he was a soldier. He maintained that he was fighting a military battle. And
we know this because at the end of his days he was giving interviews. And
he was giving interviews. He wrote a book called My Secret War. The key is in the word war. I mean, he said he believed that he was a combatant on a ferocious battlefield and the enemy would have done the same to him. That was his justification. That's not the whole story. That's never the whole story in these things. Spies, I've never come across an important spy who didn't try to justify what they were doing on a higher ideological plane. I think Philby had been a genuine ideological convert early in life. I think he was a very committed communist. I think by the time he was in his 40s, he didn't really care about communism anymore. He was hooked. I mean, secrecy, spying is a very addictive thing. I mean, and once you're hooked on it, it's quite hard to give up.
But in your book, you have him drinking more and more, and by the time he's at the end, the final denouement in Lebanon, he's a complete soak, total drunk.
He's a total drunk, but he's a very functioning drunk. I mean, he's been through so many ups and downs. I don't want to give the book away completely, but he's still on top of his game. I mean, he's not a fool. He never was a fool, Philby. I mean, he maintained that even when he escaped,
he pulls it off.
He pulls it off.
Just because it's such a good story, can we zoom in to the final scenes? So he's betrayed half the intelligence service. Thousands of people have been shot and rounded up. Spy rings left, right, and centre have been exposed. And finally, he's run to ground in Beirut.
Once Burgess and Maclean, two of the other Cambridge spies had defected to Moscow, Philby came under suspicion, and he was publicly accused of being the third man, being another of these spies.
But he's still at the top of the spy service.
Well, he's still in MI6 at this point, and he gave an extraordinary press conference. You can find it online. There's videotape of it, and he gives the most charming performance. He looks down the barrel of the gun, as it were, down the camera's lens, and just lies his head off. And it's utterly brilliant. And they use it as a training tool in MI6 today. When you go to the CISB training course, course. They show you this footage and they say, how can you tell this man's lying? And have a look at it. It's brilliant if you find it.
And what's the answer?
Well, there are various little tells. At one point, he looks down the barrel of the gun, the sort of camera, and just literally puts his tongue in his cheek. Just looks for a millisecond down the thing. Who knows? But so he was, he had to leave his job. He had to get a job as a journalist. He was never formally accused. Indeed, he was cleared by Macmillan. But then
again, partly because he had the tie, he had the accent,
it's
and they
all
couldn't
about
believe
the class
that.
system.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, the people inside MI6 who tended to be upper class public school boys could not believe that one of their own could really do that. And the book I wrote is really about the relationship between Kim Philby and his closest friend, a man called Nicholas Elliott, who they'd grown up together, they'd been to the same university, they'd joined the spy service together, and for 40 years, Philby betrayed his best friend every single day. So when they finally got evidence that Philby had been a Soviet spy, it was Elliott who was sent out to confront him.
And it's the Americans that get the evidence, not the Brits.
No, the Brits get the evidence. No, they very carefully keep it from the Americans. They really don't want the Americans to know.
Because the Americans, by the stage, are very pissed off that all their spy rings
furious that the Brits have already been penetrated. So no, this is very carefully kept away from the CIA for as long as possible. So Elliot, so Philby by this point is in Beirut. He's working for The Economist. He's working for The Observer, but he's also now back working for the KGB. He's also in touch with MI6. With Elliot, but Elliot went out to confront him, and it is the most extraordinary scene. In the apartment in Beirut, Philby was summoned to it. The thing had been bugged, and it's been recorded, and I heard the recording. I've never been allowed to take it away.
So there's somebody sitting with the tape recorder next door.
Yeah,
next door
the MI6 secretary is next door with the earphones on, taking down everything they're saying and recording the whole thing. And it sounds, if you listen to it, it sounds like two old friends having a cup of tea. Actually, there's a brutal fist fight taking place underneath the surface, where Elliot is trying to I don't want to give it away, but Elliot is trying to force Philby into a confession. And he gets a kind of half confession. He gets enough to think that he's shut him down, and that either Philby will drink himself to death in Beirut, or he'll... I think what they didn't want...
But still, they don't arrest him.
No. They didn't... What they didn't want was they didn't want Philby coming back to Britain and being put on trial. That was the worst.
Oh, so they were quite happy to let him escape?
Well, we don't know. I mean, it's one of the great mysteries. Okay, so it's an example of one of those things where I can't tell you whether they deliberately left the door open, whether it was incompetence.
Extraordinary moment. But among feeling all the other extraordinary things in this story, you've actually unmasked the former head of MI6 as a Soviet spy who's responsible for the death of thousands, and you don't arrest him.
No. I think, they didn't want a public trial. They wanted him to confess, come back to Britain, tell them everything he knew so that they could bundle up the whole thing. And that is, I think, genuinely what they thought would happen. Elliot's slightly different. You see, that's why it's all about friendship and espionage, because I think Elliot, at some level, perhaps even unconsciously, wanted Philby to get away. And they literally left the door open. I mean, he vanished. He just, overnight, he rang his house and said, "Darling, I'll be home for dinner at 8," and was never seen again. He climbed onto a Soviet freighter, Dolmatova, and popped up again in Moscow 2 months later.
It's brilliant.
Where he had a miserable time, by the way. I mean, he absolutely hated being in
Oh, did he? He
Moscow.
hated it. I'm so glad.
Yeah, no, he'd never been there. It was a country he'd never seen before. And he had a sort of idealised view of what it was going to be like. In fact, he was a prisoner, really. I mean, the KGB never trusted him. Well, yes, I mean,
And he got the Times every day and he watched the cricket.
He got the Times and read, but late. I mean, the Times, cricket results of games that were long over. It was a sort of eating sort of English marmalade that Graham Greene would bring him. It was a very strange sort of exiled life that he lived in Moscow. He tried to kill himself. That was one of the things that I discovered.
He did?
He did. I mean, I discovered that in the course of this twice. And yet he said he maintained the facade of it all having been a wonderful experience and a great experiment, and that he was proud of everything he'd done.
Oof. So we've only got 5 minutes left, so we'll have to forget about Agent Sonya, but let's do Spy and a Traitor, because this, in a sense, is the opposite story. It's the time that the British managed to penetrate the Russians in the 1980s, and it involves, and you will now unmask for the first time in public, the name of the man whose name you haven't revealed in the book.
Well, no, I wasn't allowed to reveal his name because my deal with MI6 was that although I could interview all of the case officers involved, I couldn't name them, even though some of them had in fact publicly named themselves. So I was in the bit weird position of having to anonymise people who'd actually identified who they were already. But you're right, it is in a way the flip side of the story. So if the Philby story is the story of the KGB spy inside MI6, this is the spy and the traitor is the story of the MI6 spy deep inside the KGB. Oleg Gordievsky was a career KGB officer, highly intelligent, very cultured, who was deployed by the KGB to Copenhagen in the 1960s and experienced a sort of ideological conversion, really. And he was recruited by MI6 and became really the most important spy of the Cold War. I mean, he was producing information. He ended up as designated the head of the KGB in London, where he was. I don't know if you remember when Gorbachev came to visit Thatcher, famously in 1984. One of the things the KGB had to do was to brief Gorbachev on what to say to Thatcher. But of course, that briefing was written by MI6, handed to Gordievsky, who then handed it to Gorbachev. So you have Gordievsky was briefing both sides.
Did Thatcher know this?
She knew it. Yeah. Absolutely, she knew it. Absolutely. And it was... so he plays a really pivotal role, Gordievsky, and he's still... I don't want to give too much of that story away because there is a very kind of extraordinary escape story in the middle of all of that.
But so who is the person who gets him out?
Well, so the driver of the car, of the MI6 car... So actually, we'll have to give away a bit of this. So there was a very complicated escape plan called Operation Pimlico to get Gordievsky out.
Who comes up with these names?
It's brilliant, isn't it? Well, actually, do you want to know the answer to that? There's a particular official in MI6 who comes up with a list of names, and they're supposed to be completely meaningless. But of course, they're not, and spies all over the world can never resist choosing a code name that just gives a little hint of what was going on. So Pimlico is, but it was an extraordinary plan to smuggle him out in the boot of the car. And the person driving that car was a man called Raymond Asquith.
Who is the brother of Dominic Asquith, the previous High Commissioner of Britain to New Delhi.
That's right, and Raymond was incredibly helpful with all this, and he won't mind me naming him because, in fact, he's been identified as the driver of the car.
We're going to stay in his house in a month of the Chalk Valley History
Well, in
Festival.
Hansard, when he became a peer, I mean, one of his fellow peers outed him in Hansard, so that's not unknown. But it's an extraordinary story, and Oleg Gordievsky is still alive, living in a safe house in Britain.
Writes occasional pieces of the Telegraph.
Well, alas, alas, not anymore. I mean, he's under such tight. He doesn't do anything. He really is a prisoner of history. He can't leave the house. His bodyguard is
because of Putin trying to poison ex-spies.
Yeah, I think he's considered to be sort of the prime target in a way. I mean, Putin has a personal vendetta really against Gordievsky because when Gordievsky escaped, Vladimir Putin was a young KGB officer in Leningrad, and a lot of Leningrad was blamed within the KGB quite unfairly, for allowing Gordievsky to escape, and a lot of Putin's patrons and closest were fired. So Putin has a personal dog. Raymond told me that has a personal dog in this game. So
brilliant.
Not that I think Gordievsky is necessarily a target, but and he's very elderly now. But he's an extraordinary man. He's certainly I think he's the bravest person I have ever met, but also the loneliest.
Do we know that Putin has sent people to round him up, or just they never got near enough?
No, we don't. Yeah. We don't, and I doubt it. I mean, look, it would be such an incendiary thing to do. He
went after the two other guys in Salisbury.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, that's why I think security has been tightened on him massively. I mean, it's very difficult to get to see him.
So you couldn't write this book now, probably?
I think it would be much harder to write it now. Much harder. And I used to go to the safe house. I mean, once a week I spent I think I totted it up once, about 180 hours just sitting with him. And his memory is extraordinary, it's prodigious. He really can remember exactly what was happening on a street corner in Leningrad in 1972. And
the sun was shining that day.
The sun was shining that day, absolutely. So he's a brilliant interviewee, but he's a very extraordinary man. And as I say, really, he is a prisoner of history.
So we're going to skip, because we've run out of time, Agent Sonya. one-liner on Agent Sonya.
Agent Sonya was a communist agent who appeared to be a housewife living in the Cotswolds.
Brilliant.
But in fact, in the privy, in the back garden, she'd built a very powerful radio transmitter with which she was communicating the secrets of the atomic bomb to Moscow.
Then we're going to skip Colditz, which you've just finished but hasn't come out yet. Quick one-liner on Colditz.
Colditz, yes, I loved writing about Colditz because we all have an image, a sort of myth of Colditz, which is that it is men with moustaches burrowing their way out and escaping against the odds and continuing the war by other means. Actually, the story of Colditz is all about class, sex, race.
Same as all your other books.
All my other books, really. Madness. And again, it's an opportunity to take a kind of mythologized story. There's a wonderful story of the only Indian soldier.
I'm not going to let you tell it because we're going to have you back. We're going to have you back to do it properly. But two final things to finish. First of all, your take on, again, 1 minute, on where intelligence is now vis-a-vis Ukraine, because we've just seen the leaking of vast amounts of information. I mean, opposite of the normal thing. They've presumably put all sorts of spies in the Kremlin at risk because of the detail of the stuff we're getting out, the advance warning of the invasion, and every other thing that's happening in real time now.
Absolutely. I've never seen intelligence used this way before, where they clearly have high-grade stuff coming from Moscow, and it's not even leaking it, they are publishing it before it happens. It's a quite extraordinary experiment, but you're right. Clearly, this is not just cyber intelligence. There is a human intelligence source somewhere in there, and I hope he's looking after himself.
Well, looking at the way that Putin's putting all his deputies at the other end of the table.
Absolutely. But look, I mean, if we ever thought that espionage was going out of fashion, my goodness, I mean, that war is all about smoke and mirrors, false flag operations, fake news, trying to plant a narrative of war that is on both sides. I'm not suggesting this is just one-sided.
And human intelligence is still important. It's not just eavesdropping on the internet. It's not just who are we listening to our phone calls.
It is that. A lot of it is cyber. Now, GCHQ is clearly the lead agency in Britain, but it's not the only one, because unless you have human intelligence sources, spying is still at its essence about looking at somebody across a table and trying to work out if they're lying to you. And that's as important to...
They got their tongue in their cheek.
They got their tongue in their cheek. And of course, you can't tell from their text messages that they may all be false. They may all be a ruse. So human intelligence is as vital as it's ever been.
So just to finish, we have a showing tomorrow night, I think, of Mincemeat. Yeah. But that is not your only... that is not your only adaptation coming out, earning you vast sums of money in even this 6 months. Tell us the two other wonderful films.
Well, there's a TV series of a book I wrote about the SAS, about the founding of the SAS in the North African desert. That's a BBC series, and that...
Long Range Desert Group, all that stuff.
Starts with the Long Range Desert Group. It's David Sterling and Paddy Mayne. And
Olive's great uncle.
There you go. All these slightly bonkers people kind of blowing things up in the desert. I mean, it's a wonderful
My
thing.
Uncle Mart, too.
There you go. It's written by Steve Knight, who made Peaky Blinders. So it has that fantastic kind of rocking soundtrack, and it's utterly brilliant, I think.
And sort of vaguely sort of eroto...
There's lots of male nudity, yeah. Male nudity and explosives. What's not to like?
Good. So Public school boys all over again. Here we go.
It's got Dominic West in it. It's brilliant. So that's BBC. That will be out in September, probably. And then the Spy Among Friends, the Kim Philby story I was describing.
I'm looking forward to seeing a series where Dominic West keeps his clothes on. It's going to be
Actually, this one, he does keep his clothes on, but they are women's clothing. And then A Spy Among Friends is going to be in October, and that is Sony and ITV, and that's with Dominic West, with Damian Lewis and Guy
Homeland
Pearce.
guy, yeah.
Yeah, and Anna Maxwell Martin. They're playing Kim Philby and Nicholas Elliott. So that's another six-parter that will be in the autumn.
Anna Maxwell Martin is playing Kim Philby.
So Anna Maxwell Martin is playing the MI5 investigator who's trying to work out... I won't give it away. Yes, who's trying to work out why Philby got away.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Macintyre. I hope that you sell 1 million more copies.
Thank you, Willie.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Willie. Thank you.